Hello, everyone, and welcome to Growing Together, a gardening podcast with me, John Lamb, and Don Kinsler, a lifelong gardener and the North Dakota State University Extension horticulturist for Cass County. Don, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, John. How about you?
I'm doing pretty good. Here we are. It's the end of January. We were just talking. The weather's looking pretty good.
It is looking good, and I'm excited today to talk trees.
It is. So tell us a little bit about who's with us today.
Well, one of my co-workers in NDSU Extension, Joe Zeleznik, the Extension Forester. Welcome, Joe.
Thanks for having me, Don. And John.
Yeah, no problem. We've been meaning to have you in for a while. Pretty much for the last year we've been talking about this, which is how long we've been doing the podcast. So you've been on our to get list, as they say, as far as,
we all love trees.
Yeah. Well, we've got lots of questions about that, but I think let's hear a little bit about you. First of all, how did you get into forestry?
I grew up in northeast Ohio, about 30 miles east of Cleveland, out in the country, in the maple syrup capital of Ohio.
Oh.
My sister was the maple queen in 1975.
Good for her, yeah.
Yes.
That's awesome.
And I worked at a tree farm growing up. And we harvested. Yeah, we harvested timber there and Christmas trees. We grew Christmas trees and sold those every year.
Nice.
Wholesale mostly. So I just loved it and kind of fell into it. I did get my undergraduate degree actually in chemistry, go figure, but then my master's and PhD were in forestry.
Well, you say you harvested some lumber there, right?
Yes.
What kind of, when you're talking maples, is maplewood?
Yeah, most of it was maple. There was a little bit of beech as well, and I think some oak, don't recall for sure. And then there was one called cucumber tree.
Okay.
Really?
Which is a type of magnolia, big magnolia tree you find in the eastern U.S., and it actually makes some pretty good timber, as well as it had pretty good water resistance properties, the lumber from that tree.
Well, it's a good day. I learned something new. I don't think I had heard of cucumber tree.
Yep,
it's
a magnolia. Go figure.
Cool.
Magnolias can survive that far north, huh?
Oh, well, these types can. The ornamentals, they were okay.
Not so much.
Yeah.
And there's a variety of an Ohio buckeye that's pretty popular around here, right? Or that can be used around here.
Yes, there's actually 3 of them. NDSU has a release called Prairie Torch.
That's beautiful.
It is. There's one called, what are the other two called? Lava Burst is another NDSU release that's coming out. And then there's one from the University of Minnesota.
Yeah, let's see, Autumn Splendor maybe? Or is that South Dakota?
It's either one or the other.
One or the other, yeah.
One has Autumn Splendor and the other has Homestead.
Oh, yeah, Homestead, correct. And I've quit calling them Ohio Buckeye because people want, Ohio. So I've just been calling them Buckeye. Is that okay?
I think so, because I think most of the Buckeyes we have around here are probably hybrids.
Sure.
I don't know that they're
beautiful trees.
Buckeyes. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about what you do with the Extension Service, what your role in forestry and the Extension Service is.
Well, I've been there for 21 years, and I'm a state specialist, so I have statewide duties. And it's anything from developing new materials, of course, new educational materials, I should emphasize that, as well as doing educational programs throughout the state, sometimes in support of the county extension agents, sometimes working with other partners. Right now I'm working with North Dakota Forest Service as well as North Dakota Department of Ag on some emerald ash borer training. So it's a little bit of everything, especially since I'm statewide.
It's interesting. You mentioned the emerald ash borer, and of course that's been very much on our minds and the minds of many people. So tell us a little bit about that. Okay, now, when was it discovered on North Dakota's doorstep?
Okay, and I'm glad you said it that way, on the doorstep.
On the doorstep.
It hasn't been found here. It was February 9th of last year, 2023.
So almost a year.
And it was found by the city forestry crew in Moorhead. They were out just doing regular tree pruning, their annual tree pruning, and they found a branch that was suspect, and they started to peel the bark back and found some larvae of emerald ash borer. They found the galleries that the larvae, the tunnels that they produce. And yeah, I was pretty sure it was. Of course, there was a whole official process to go through for officially confirming it is.
Now, when you say it was suspect, what made them suspect that?
Quite frankly, it was something simple called a bark split. And when a tree is first attacked by EAB and there's just a few larvae hitting it, they produce these tunnels under the bark, and that'll kill a small area under the bark, and that'll be dead. And the tree will continue growing around that, but the bark will kind of split apart. Sure. And this is one of the first things we look for. It's real subtle, though, and they just happen to be in the right place at the right time.
Oh, that's interesting. And so now it has not been found in North Dakota?
Correct.
But it's close, isn't it?
It's awfully close. A lot of people suspect that we do have it here, that we just haven't found it yet, and that certainly could be. The city forestry crew in Moorhead, they've been looking. They look every day. City forestry crew in Fargo, all our local contractors that are doing pruning or tree removals, they all look. I look when I'm driving around. I haven't found it here, and that's fine. It is what it is. We'll keep looking, and we won't stop. Now that said, it was found in Moorhead first, but when we started looking a little more regionally, locally, it was actually more prevalent in Dilworth, and we think that's where it probably came in first. Sure.
And now it's also interesting because in kind of reading about that, I've often wondered if it would be the insect would be winter hardy enough to survive our winters. Mm-hmm. But also Winnipeg has had it, Craig?
Yes, Winnipeg's had it since 2017.
So does that mean it probably would be? Because it's pretty chilly in Winnipeg.
Yeah, yes,
so
absolutely.
Does that mean it is surviving winter in Winnipeg?
Yes. Yeah, and there's no doubt it'll survive winters here as well, of course. What I expect to happen, and this is, I have to say, it's an educated guess, is that it'll just be slow to develop, slow to spread here. Yes, they'll survive. If we get the super cold temperatures, 30 below or even colder, that'll knock back 90+% of them, and which is great, but that still means 10% have survived. And because of that, the populations will build up again and it'll continue to spread. So if we get those cold temperatures every few years, it'll just slow it down.
Sure. Now, I'm always interested with some of these invasive insects. They develop trapping mechanisms that they put around to monitor for these and try to trap these insects. Are they doing that with emerald ash borer around the state?
Yes. North Dakota Department of Agriculture is leading those efforts, and they've been doing this for years.
Yeah. What type of trap? What entices an emerald ash borer to go into a trap?
Well, these are the traps that are used for EAB. That's not something they go into. It's actually something they go onto. It's a sticky board.
Oh, interesting.
These big purple triangles, that's how I'll describe it. Triangular prism, maybe?
Yeah, I think I've
better description of it.
I have seen those.
Yeah, and they're purple, and that helps to attract them. There's really been, with all the research, all the efforts that have gone towards finding the best traps, yeah, some are a little better than others, but nothing's great. Not like the Japanese beetle. The Japanese beetle traps and those lures, those work really well. Emerald ash borer traps are okay. And surprisingly, and I mentioned the city forestry crew is the ones who found it, most of the time that's how we find EAB, or EAB has been found around the U.S., is by people and the forestry crews.
Oh, sure. Now, when you say around the U.S., of course, it's kind of marched across the United States. And what impact has it had on ash trees? I mean, we have a lot of ash trees in the state and Minnesota.
Yes, we do. It has had a huge impact. Our native green ash, native to North Dakota, black ash, native to Minnesota, and a tiny little spot in North Dakota up by Walhalla. We're expecting 100% mortality. And I have to kind of temper that just a touch in that in some places like Michigan, where it was first discovered, they get sprouts of ash trees coming up. And those sprouts will last several years, but certainly not, they're not providing a huge component to the forest like they did before. So we can expect the green ash trees to pretty much all die.
Because, when you drive around our cities and towns, Fargo and almost any town, the ash was promoted so heavily for so many years as a good replacement for, of course, the elm trees. And so, wow, it's hard to imagine our cities without ash trees. It's going to be bare. The possibility.
Yes, very possible. So in North Dakota, I got to say the North Dakota Forest Service, kudos to them. They've done a great job of doing a lot of inventories of the smaller communities, and they've got some great data. And some cities, the population of ash trees is, I'll say low, I'll say 30% of the urban forest. But in some places it's as high as 80%.
Sure. In
Fargo, the city forester has been working for 10 years or more to really try to reduce the percent of ash trees that are public, part of the urban forest that's public, what he can control. And about 10 or 12 years ago, he started at 40%. He's down to about 23%.
I find that really encouraging. A person could get really down in the mouth about emerald ash borer and losing ash trees, but I find it really encouraging that the city foresters, such as Fargo, are really being proactive. They aren't waiting for all the trees to die. They're removing some of the old, and some of the ash trees are really scraggly. Are some of the older varieties.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's not like they're just wholesale getting rid of them. And
right.
We were talking about this, and what do you do for a management approach? Do you just get rid of ash before they even die and start replacing now? Or do you wait till EAB's here and just be reactive? Or do you find somewhere in the middle? And that's what they've really done.
Yeah, I really find that encouraging because I've noticed on some of the streets in Fargo, some maybe relatively young ash trees have been cut down and replaced with species not susceptible to them. I really find that encouraging, the proactive approach to it.
Yeah. The kind of the criteria they're looking for are the thought process is to get rid of younger ash trees that we haven't invested a whole lot of time in. They're not providing a whole lot of public benefit yet.
Sure.
And replace those right away. And as well as you mentioned some of the scraggly trees that are under power lines, trees that are otherwise in decline. Let's get rid of those too. And let's focus our efforts then, our efforts to retain trees on those ones that are in good health, that are decent size. And along those lines, they've actually started to inject them with insecticide to help prevent EAB from hitting those trees.
Sure. Oh, now a common question that I get from homeowners is, most are aware that emerald ash borer, the possibilities. So I'm getting many questions from people in summer especially as to, is there something that a homeowner can do? Is there an injection, an insecticide? Is there something that they can do? How would you answer that?
There are several insecticides that are useful. The most common one for homeowners is the product, the active ingredient's called imidacloprid. There's a bunch of different products, and it's
a mouthful.
Yes. Yes, it is.
You pronounce it better than I do.
Imidacloprid is super easy to apply. You just mix it up according to the directions on the label, and you pour it on the ground at the base of the tree, and the tree brings it up. And
now, is that a yearly?
That is a yearly
Sure.
application. There is another insecticide that's more effective called emamectin benzoate that is usually—
Another mouthful.
Yes, it's another mouthful. That's usually applied, though, as an injection, and you need specialized equipment for that.
Sure. So some of the tree care professionals,
yes,
I suppose, would be applying products such as that.
Yeah, and there's about 8 or 10 companies offering in the Fargo-Moorhead area that are offering that service right now.
Sure.
So if people have something on their private property, should they be contacting the city? Just say, I have this tree. Do you come to take a look at it? Or what's the best approach for?
For trees on private property, I would contact one of these consulting arborists or one of the tree care companies locally. City pretty much has their hands full with just the public trees, boulevard trees and others. And you mentioned parks. It's kind of interesting. Fargo actually has a city forester and a park district forester because there's that much work.
Sure.
The two are separate in Fargo. In other communities, it's just one person.
Has the emerald ash borer, I mean, obviously it's ashes in its name, but have they been known to move on to other trees and to damage other trees or other living things?
Oh, that's a great question. I love it. There's a few trees or shrubs that they can attack, but there's nothing we have around here. One's called white fringe tree. It's in the southeastern U.S., and privet, which is also in the southeastern U.S., and those don't grow here.
And how fast does it move as far as how fast has the spread been? You said it started really in Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, like Don was saying, like it's worked its way across the country almost. How fast, and because earlier you talked too about like if we get a really, really cold snap that could kill back 90%, still leaves 10%, how fast then would could the growth of this infestation be?
Sure. There's so many components to that question.
Right.
On its own, the insect doesn't fly that far. The female that comes out, that emerges, she'll fly either to the same tree that she emerged from or the next tree over. Usually they can fly up to 10 miles, but usually it's the next tree or maybe as far as a half a mile, but that's about it.
So given that, when would a homeowner, if they do opt to start treating their tree, when would a homeowner or when would they know, should I start treating it, or am I just, pouring money down a rat hole because it's nowhere near? How would a homeowner know if they want to start treating?
Okay. Our general recommendation is to not treat unless EAB has been found within 15 miles. And that recommendation was developed in the eastern U.S., and we've kind of adopted it here.
And I'm sure that'll be a headline when when we do actually find
Sure.
in North Dakota.
Now, to follow up on that, though, yes, any individual insect isn't going to fly far. What we're more worried about is people moving firewood or nursery stock, infested nursery stock, which usually isn't the issue anymore. It's more about moving firewood.
Sure. Firewood coming back and forth to the lakes and from here to there. Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, I see that a lot. I actually live out by Detroit Lakes, so I drive Highway 10 every day, and I'm amazed how many trailers there are, people hauling firewood, both directions.
So that the emerald ash borer wouldn't even have to do any work on flying. They could be carted, the Uber, the Uber for emerald ash borer.
In something like this, which is we're talking about an infestation. It's a big concern. How has been working between, you're in North Dakota and this was found in Minnesota. Like you said, it's the doorstep. It's really just look across the Red River and it's there potentially. How have the states been working together pretty well? Has there been a lot of cooperation between the states and the communities?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Actually, I've been exchanging emails this past week with John Ostis of the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, because it is that side of the river, and Minnesota Department of Agriculture is the regulatory organization in Minnesota. So they're doing a lot of the management as well as, of course, a lot of the educational or outreach programs. And John and I are going to be offering a couple of those in March in Dilworth. At least that's the plan. We're still finalizing details because, hey, we have a lot of people in North Dakota who want to learn, and it's right on the doorstep. We're closer to it than he is down in the cities.
Yeah.
So we're really working together, and I appreciate the cooperation we've got there.
So, well, emerald ash borer is certainly enough, to be on the horizon here. Any other tree insects, diseases, as though that wasn't enough. Anything else on the horizon, or are we good?
Well, it's funny. I look at a lot of the research that's coming out, the information that's coming out from around the country. There's some really bad things in other parts of the U.S.
Oh, like what?
Of course, spotted lanternfly, which I say, of course, and maybe you're not familiar with it. Spotted lanternfly was found in Pennsylvania and New York. Oh, I'm not sure how many years ago, but it's really decimating the grape industry and the wine.
Item number 2 I learned today. It's especially a good day.
Yeah. And there's a lot of concern about that.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. And now, as it turns out, it probably won't survive here. It needs a specific tree called Tree of Heaven to complete its life cycle, and we can't grow Tree of Heaven here in North Dakota.
Interesting.
Yeah. One thing that has been concern here in North Dakota the last few years for trees and other things is the Japanese beetle.
Sure.
And that's been on and off, I want to say for about 10 or 12 years, just a few beetles here or there. They especially hit linden trees. But last year,
they attack like 300 species of plants, right? Everything from alfalfa to rose bushes.
Yes.
Speaking of rose bushes, in Fargo here on 8th Street, there is a yellow rose bush that the Japanese beetles have been attacking for the last number of years. They've been spotted there.
Sure.
So, it's
Japanese beetle, they devastate roses and linden trees. Where I grew up, there was another street just down the road. It was called Basswood, and American linden is also called basswood. And Basswood Street had no basswoods on it because there were so many Japanese beetles around.
Just in comparison, because I think around here, I can't even remember when the Dutch elm disease was at the 70s or 80s.
60s maybe in this
late
area?
60s,
Late 60s?
It was discovered in North Dakota, so the mid-70s into the early 80s is probably when it was just going through everything.
Yeah, so growing up, that's what I remember. That was and kind of I know they're different, but compare, the threat of Dutch elm disease versus emerald ash borer, or would they be similar as far as the amount of destruction that each kind of infestation could reap?
They are similar in that they could mostly wipe out all. Now, with Dutch elm disease, there's a little bit of a delay in that Dutch elm disease is caused by a fungus, and the fungus is spread by a beetle. So you need this combination of factors to spread it. And there's about 1 in 200 elm trees are resistant to DED, which is great, but and EAB, pretty much no resistance. So there's
that's interesting, yeah.
And the other thing about Dutch elm disease is because of that beetle being the thing that spreads the fungus, if you manage the beetle's habitat and reduce the beetle's habitat, then you really slow down. Fargo has a great elm population. The reason we have it is because if the city forestry department identifies a tree that's infected with DED, they remove it really quickly. Within 2 weeks is the ideal. What's the beetle's habitat? Dead and dying elm trees. So you identify a tree, you cut it, get rid of it, and you've lowered the habitat. So instead of losing 10 to 20% of the trees every year, you're down to losing only 1%.
Sure, because the old neighborhoods in Fargo with the elms that arch over the
8th Street, and all those
8th
great,
Street. Yeah, beautiful.
All right, we're going to take a quick little break. When we come back, more with Joe Zeleznik.
When you can't make it to City Hall or school board meetings, local journalists from Inforum.com will be there to report the facts and get your questions answered. Local news works for you. Stay up to date at Inforum.com.
Okay, we're back with Joe Zeleznik from the North Dakota State University Extension, the Extension Forester, correct?
Yes.
And so weather-wise, this is depending on who you ask, we've had John Wheeler on. He said it's maybe different, but it's not unheard of, the winter weather. And just wanted to see how this is affecting trees in our area and what effect do you see it having on trees or working on trees?
Mostly, I don't think it's going to be a problem. It's we'll see. We've still got 2 more months of winter. We'll see what that
2 months
brings.
or more.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting to me because we're in a place where we don't have a lot of native forest and we have a lot of ornamentals. And sometimes those ornamentals are really borderline hardy for our region. And that's where we sometimes get into trouble in terms of either it gets too awfully cold in the winter, which we haven't really had, or we get these midwinter warm-ups. And that's what really messes with some of these less adapted trees.
Like which ones come to mind? I mean, and we don't want to scare people, but when you're talking about the ornamentals and ones that maybe aren't as...
Sure. I'll give the example of, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, some of the Asian birches and the European white birch throughout the state got hammered. We got a big warm-up. I think it was in February, might have been March, but it was really warm up into the 50s and maybe even 60s in some areas in February or March. And those trees broke out of dormancy. And I don't know how much they started to grow. If anything, they were probably just breaking out. and then it got cold again, and they couldn't harden up again quick enough. And we had a lot of dieback on trees.
And then in May, when trees start leafing out, my email inbox was filled with birch problems, people whose birch did not fully leaf out. Maybe the bottom part leafed out, the upper part was dead, and wondering what the problem was then. And it's like you say, the trees had somehow warmed up enough, and and it was, I can't even say, it probably numbered close to 1,000 of calls and emails I got from, I might be exaggerating a little, but it was almost unheard of, the amount, and that was so clear and so devastating.
Yes.
Now, when you talk about the dieback, is that a permanent dieback, or does that just mean for that growing season it's not going to grow, or what was the effect on the overall tree?
It was pretty much permanent.
Okay.
There were a few trees. I heard stories of people saying individually that, this tree did come back later on, but I've never seen evidence of that.
Those that I examined, both from photographs and follow-up, or those that I went in person to look at, the upper, maybe 2/3 of the tree, roughly, or half, was dead. Dead as in nothing's going to come out of that. And then the bottom, maybe 1/3 that was still alive. But how do you get a tree back into shape when the top is all dead?
Yeah.
And so those ended up being removed. The other thing that I noticed too, as a follow-up, maybe the following year, those birches that had been damaged, bronze birch borer then invaded those that had been, not totally dead, but damaged, and then the insects moved in.
Sure.
So a good example of how this winter fluctuation can affect trees.
Yeah. Yes, we get cold, but you know what? It's how quickly we get cold, or how quickly we warm up, or the variability that really affects trees a lot more, at least in our region.
So the gradual increases and decreases in weather, works to our advantage as far as growing.
Absolutely. Yes. If it's just a gradual cool down, trees can definitely deal with it. They can gradually become hardier and hardier. But if it's quick,
I've got a question for you. Okay, when there was that kind of midwinter fake out of these, I'm stealing that phrase from you, Joe. I've heard you use that midwinter fake out, where it warmed up enough, the birch kind of thought it was spring, things started happening, and then when the temperatures got cold again, they were injured. Why didn't that happen to all trees?
I'll try to simplify it. It's a little technical. So there's when trees break bud in the spring, when they break dormancy, I ask people, what's the cause of that? And they immediately say, well, it's the longer days and the warmer temperatures. And I say, well, yes, sort of. Okay, there's another part of it that I learned in college for a test once, and I never understood until I moved here and started putting two together. And it's a concept called chilling hours. That is a tree, and other plants, but trees, they need a certain number of hours lower than, it's either 45 or 47 degrees down to 32 degrees, and they need a certain number of hours accumulated over the winter. It could be 500 hours. It could be 1,000. It could be 2,000. It really depends on the individual species. And once they meet those chilling requirements, then they can respond in the spring to those warmer temperatures, the longer days. If their chilling requirements haven't been met, then it doesn't matter if there's that midwinter warm-up. They're not going to respond. So some of these ornamentals that come from further south, they have their chilling requirements met. So once we get warm, they break dormancy. But our native trees, they haven't had those requirements met, so they just stay dormant.
But what a wonderful natural Mother Nature's method of keeping those trees, the well-adapted natives, dormant. Mm-hmm. So that then when spring actually does arrive, then they've met their requirement and they'll start growing. So that's neat, isn't it? That they have
it's really
to have
fascinating.
That so our January thaws and different things don't fake out the well-adapted trees. Yeah, what a neat mechanism.
one thing I've been noticing this winter, and maybe it's just my neighborhood, and I know that you're not a city forester, but I've seen more city forestry trucks out and working on trees on the boulevard. And is that just kind of standard winter, or is there something because of the winter weather this year that allows them to, whether it's less snow or ice, that allows them to get up and they're actually able to do more work this winter?
My guess is it's pretty specific to your neighborhood. So the city forestry crews, every winter they prune, and they also contract out some pruning to some local tree care companies. And every winter they're out, and they work in certain sections of the city each year. And it's not like they cover the entire city, individual trees. They really, to make it more efficient for them, they work neighborhoods. And they're on about a 7-year cycle, I think. And so they're probably just more prominent in your neighborhood this winter.
Of course, speaking about pruning, with the ice storms that were prevalent in the region recently, there was a lot of homeowners that were needing to do pruning because of the ice damage, splitting limbs and things. And a question that I frequently get, usually accompanied by nice photos, is when either wind or an ice storm bends a main side limb down and it starts to crack and peels itself down, but it's still attached. A common question is, if I hurry, can I bring that limb back up, tie it up really good, and will it kind of heal itself back? I know it sounds like wishful thinking, but is there anything to that?
I'd say it's mostly wishful thinking.
I believe it.
There's a possibility if you do it quickly and hold it close, hold it firmly in place somehow, that it could graft itself back in or callus over. But to have any kind of really good success, it would have to be a really small limb.
Yeah, and I think most people do end up just cutting that off. And any suggestions when someone does have a limb that kind of falls, breaks off, any suggestions kind of in how to cut or make that wound maybe heal or seal itself? Any suggestions?
A lot of people want to go with wound sealants, pruning paint, and the research has shown minimal effect on those. So make a proper pruning cut and let the tree callus over that wound. And that's
Isn't that amazing, too, to see a wound that I think we've all seen trees, sometimes in nature, where a limb has been fallen or broken off, and then that neat roll of callus over a wound. I find that fascinating, the way a tree can seal that itself off with that roll of callus.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. That said, though, it does take time, and while it's growing over that wound, there's a chance that a fungus could get in and infect the tree, a rot-based fungus or rot-type fungus that could infect the tree. And it's really this race between the fungus and the tree to see which gets established first. Does the fungus get in and really establish, or does the tree grow over that wound and seal out the fungus? And a rough rule of thumb is we try to keep pruning wounds less than about 3 inches.
Oh, yeah.
But that's very rough.
Sure.
I took some measurements on an elm tree that was pruned near my house years ago, and it was about 3 1/4 inches. Took 6 years to grow over that, and it was a healthy tree.
Yeah. Now, I know, Joe, that your appointment is mostly extension outreach, but do you also have a research component to your position?
I do not.
You don't. I know you've done research because I've seen videos of you standing out in the Red River with a chainsaw cutting oak trees, and you and I visited with that. In fact, I wrote a garden column about it. That is a fascinating. Can you tell us about that? What were you doing in the middle of the Red River with a chainsaw, sawing up old limbs?
Oh, that's probably one of the funnest things I've been able to do in my 21 years. And also one of the muddiest things I've done in my 21 years. A colleague from the University of Minnesota and we got a grant to look for buried oak logs in the Red River that ideally have been buried 2 or 3 or 4 or 500 years. And we're looking at the tree rings for evidence of flooding. If an oak tree gets flooded at the right time in the spring, when the ring is developing, it leaves a signature. There are these big cells called vessels, and during a flood, at the right time, they just don't develop as big. They're smaller, and you can actually see this in the rings. For example, in 2009, we can see in the ring, in 2010 and 2006 and 2005, you can see in the rings these vessels are really small.
And of course, an old oak log down in the bottom of the mud in the Red River, oak doesn't deteriorate very quickly.
Correct.
And so is that why you were looking for oak?
Well, that's part of it. The other thing is...
or because it does show that.
It shows that.
Sure.
Ash can show that as well, but elm doesn't, box elder doesn't. Hackberry, basswood, they don't do it. It's really...
Now, when I saw the video of you out in the middle of the Red River, at times the Red River can be fairly deep, but it wasn't really deep. Now, I suppose these dry, droughty summers that we've had were probably ideal.
Yes. In 2021, which was the driest, we did a little over 300 miles of the Red River out of 406 or 411, I think the Red River has, from the Canadian border upstream to Wahpeton. And we did over 300 of them.
So as the red got kind of lower because of the dry summers, so then were you able to see those logs, or did you have to kind of pull some up out of the mud? How did you go about finding these oak logs?
It was a little bit of both. There was always two people in the boat, so we had two pairs of eyes looking, and boy, there's a lot of logs out there that aren't oak, and you try to develop an eye for...
How do you tell? Yeah, I'm just going to say, if it's been underwater for a period of time and probably some mud and sediment around it, and also the natural decay of maybe the bark, or doesn't the bark decay? I don't know. No, so how do you tell?
The bark does decay. Okay. All I can really say is that oak, the way it decays or the way it breaks down is a little different than the others. Sort of, which is so vague.
A trained eye is what you're saying.
And even with the trained eye, we're still like, we would stop and check to make sure you take a saw and you cut a little piece out of it, or an axe and break off a little piece. Even with our trained eyes, I don't think we're better than 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 actually being oak. So it's a lot of effort.
So you were looking for oak, old oak. Okay, and oak can show through its rings years that were flooded. So why were you doing this?
Okay, so in 1826, I know you may not remember that time.
That's beyond my time.
Yes. 1826 was the flood of the century, the flood of record in Winnipeg. So Winnipeg was settled in about 1810. So there were certainly settlers there a lot earlier than there were here. And in 1826, it flooded, and they said the water never went down all summer.
Wow.
Yeah. And after the 1990s...
Because that's of record.
And that's of record,
that's of record.
And after the 1997 flood, some colleagues from Manitoba decided to see if they could find evidence of this 1826 flood in tree rings elsewhere beyond
Manitoba. Because the Fargo area,
the
Red River Valley at a certain point and south was not settled.
Correct.
Because Fargo was, approximately 1870?
Yeah, thereabouts. Yep.
So I suppose with the question, what happened in Fargo area in 1826? How far did that flood go? Fascinating.
And that was really the question we were trying to answer, is how far upstream could we find evidence of it? And you look for old trees, of course, and try to core them so you don't kill the tree, don't cut it down. And finding an oak tree in our area that dates to 1826 or earlier is really, really hard. There's so many of them were cut down around 1870.
Sure.
Very few of them were left. Make cabins, firewood.
Sure.
So we look for old trees, and that was not so successful. With permission, there's a lot of cabins that are still around, and with permission, we were able to sample a bunch of those. And
so that's interesting. So some of those old oak that would have been around in 1826 could have been cut down then for log cabins.
Right.
Well, so interesting. So in addition to looking in the river, you were looking for those logs that were in cabins.
Yes, and one cabin in particular. It was kind of falling apart, and the landowner was going to take it down, so he let us really extensively take samples up near Shelley, Minnesota. And that one, the trees were cut in 1876, and they were well over 200 years old when they were cut.
Oh, sure. So they would have been existing, growing.
Yeah, sure. And the oldest one was 275 years old when it was cut, so it goes to the earliest ring was 1601.
Wow.
Yeah, that was really cool. And out of those 32 samples, 28 of them showed the 1826 flood. So,
all right, so that would have been at least at Shelley, Minnesota.
Yes. And then if we work our way further upstream towards Fargo, we see a few examples of it. It's certainly not 28 out of 32. It's 1 in 20 or 2 or 3 out of 20 are showing it. And the farthest upstream we found it is Fargo. The Hector cabin out at Bonanzaville. Sure. A few years ago, they were doing some restoration work, and they pulled out 2 or 3 logs and inserted 2 or 3 new ones in. And I was fortunate enough to get samples of those 2 or 3 logs that they pulled out, and one of them showed the 1826 flood.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And we've got samples dating to 1826 further south from Fargo, but we really haven't found anything.
That's interesting. Just fascinating. Now, when I think of a log cabin, and you kind of look at the ends there where they're kind of meshed together, fit together just like a Lincoln Logs. And when I think of the end, it's really weathered. So how do you study the grain of that? Do you have to make a new cut, or how do you study the grain?
There's a couple different ways we do it. And, of course, destructive sampling where we would actually cut a chunk out.
Sure.
That's the easiest. But, of course, then we don't want to destroy the cabin. But if it's falling apart and they're taking it down, I'll be happy to make a new cut. We have taken cores out of a few of those, which is really hard to do on a dry log, let me tell you. The other way is to simply sand it down to a really, really fine polish and take up-close photos. And if you know the sequence of narrow rings, wide rings, you can pick out what year is what.
Yeah, what a fascinating historical record, because the Winnipeg knew, we didn't know for sure down here, but what a that gives kind of a flooding, a wider snapshot of not just 150 years or something, but just a wider snapshot of the flooding in the Red River Valley. I just think that's fascinating how Oaks, give you a record.
Is this a project that's still going on, that's still in the undertaking, or have you wrapped up that and published your
It's still going on. Of course, with COVID, and there were some other delays going on. So we're getting closer. Last fall, we were able to finally finish up the last 44 miles north of Grand Forks, north of Drayton. It was pretty far up there, but we're finally able to do that. And actually, next week, I'm hoping we can finish with those samples. Of course, there's still some from previous years we're slowly working through. And I'm hoping by the end of the summer we can wrap this up.
So no more time in the river with a chainsaw for you.
Well, actually, it's funny that you ask that, because there are some samples that we look at and go, boy, we need to go back and resample that one. And so I might go knocking on some doors or making some phone calls rather than getting in a boat and going up and down the river. Hopefully we can just drive right up to it.
But what a fascinating world of forestry. It is just awesome. I got to ask you, Joe, what's your favorite tree? Probably asking me what's my favorite vegetable, or But what? Do you have a favorite tree?
I do, but it doesn't grow well here in North Dakota.
What's that?
It's the sugar maple.
Yeah, sure,
absolutely. Because for a variety of reasons, one is, of course, you can get the sap and maple syrup, so that's fun. And the wood itself is beautiful. It's really hard. They use it for basketball courts, and now even some of the modern baseball bats. So, and it's a pretty tree, nice orange in the fall.
Yeah, it is.
You live in the Detroit Lakes area. Obviously, there's a lot of Highway 10. There's a lot of back and forth. We talked about that. It's a very different look for trees there, isn't it? What makes that, just quickly, or not quickly, but I know it's kind of a general question, but you see a lot of different trees there, and even around the lakes area, it changes very kind of abruptly from the maples to the evergreens, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And that just blows me away. It's one of the fascinating things I love about where I live is that you do see that transition from the hardwood or the deciduous forest to the prairie. I see that every day going both directions. And yes, out there, yes, it's a little bit colder, but it's about 2 or 3 extra inches of moisture every year. And that's enough to make it forest.
Isn't that amazing?
Yes.
The grassland, the transition to the forest.
Sure. And we can grow sugar maples there. We can grow northern red oak, northern pin oak, yellow birch, there's one called slippery elm, which I'm not sure that it grows here or not. But anyway, there's a bunch of trees that'll grow there, but do poorly here or won't grow at all. They're not native here. And it's because of our high pH prairie soils. It was mostly they're plenty cold hardy.
Yep.
But they just can't handle
That's
the
why
high
I've
pH
grown
soils.
to hate autumn blaze maple.
Yes.
Not because I hate it, but because I get lots and lots of emails from very disappointed homeowners.
Sure.
Sometimes they do well, but oftentimes they don't. And so I've become weary of autumn blaze maple.
It's probably more of an issue of not zone tolerance, but soil tolerance is what you're saying.
I think with autumn blaze, it's actually a little bit of both because I think that one was selected in Ohio.
Oh, sure.
So it is a little bit of both there. But even other of those, they're called Freeman maples.
Sure.
They're hybrids between red maple and silver maple. So many of those, they just don't do well here, even if they are cold hardy.
All right. Well, thank you very much for coming by and talking. This was really great. And
great tree discussion.
And especially hearing kind of an update or where we are with the emerald ash borer. You were saying that maybe later this spring there may be you may be doing a presentation.
Yes, working with, again, colleagues from Minnesota Department of Agriculture as well as North Dakota Department of Agriculture. We're hoping to hold some workshops March 26th and 27th in Dilworth, just like short 1-hour workshops on EAB. The details are still being finalized, and we'll see what the weather is like. But we're aiming for March 26th and 27th.
Yeah, if you can send that to Don whenever you got a date for that, we'll talk about that on the show. We'll bring that back up. And Don, if people have questions for you about trees or the weather or the summer coming up, what's the best way to reach you?
Send me an email. Photos are always great too, and share your successes and things that don't quite go so well. My email is donald.kinsler, KINZLER, @ndsu.edu.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
And Joe, thank you. This has been a great discussion on trees.
Thanks. Had a lot of fun today, guys.
Thank you.